And I want to, we're very happy to be jointly doing things with the Center for the Social Medicine, right? No, I had it in my head, and then there's like so many centers around here. So the Center for Social Medicine, and there are a lot of groups on campus, and for us, it's always discovering new groups. And even though there are people with people that we know very well, but they're new groups. So we represent the Center for African Studies, and in the past, in the last couple of years, we've been doing noontime events, but we're actually switching this year to public events about once a month or so in the afternoon. So be on the lookout for that. And we'll also be doing a lot of joint things with other centers. So if you're not already on our list, Tammy in the back there has a form that you can fill out.
Yeah,
and it's definitely, because the way Berkeley is, if we serve any kind of food, then you need to sign the list so that we can dot all the I's and cross all the T's and get all the reimbursements done. So, but we want to welcome you here. Our director, Leo Adiello, will be showing up at some point. He's a chameleon and ends up everywhere on campus all the time. So anyway, I think at this I'm going to give it over to Charles to do the formal introduction of Sam, who's a great friend of us, especially because of the work he does on sport, but we'll talk about that later. All right, thanks.
Thank you. So wonderful to be able to now welcome you again to this sort of instantiation, which is the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine. I'm Charles Briggs. I'm the co-director. Seth Holmes, who I guess isn't here right now, is the other co-director of the center. And it's a wonderful treat to be able to start off our new academic year of lectures and other events for the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine with a talk by Sam Dubal. And so I have stage instructions here, for which I've also modified. The first thing says, please, if you have electronic devices which make awful noises, please make sure they don't do that in the course of the event. Dr. Dubal will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have a robust discussion. So it's really fun to be able to introduce also in another hat, which is I'm the co-director of the PhD program in medical anthropology, one of our distinguished alumni, Dr. Sam Dubal, who is a medical anthropologist and also an MD. He is currently a visiting scholar with the center. Here does entered his PhD in medical anthropology in the joint program, which links, it's a unique program which actually exists between two universities linking to UCSF and its Department of Anthropology, History and Social Medicine across the water and to the Berkeley campus. And he also got his MD from Harvard Medical School and completed his internship in general surgery at Harvard UCLA Medical Center. And has also had a research position at the Makerere Institute of Social Research in Kampala, Uganda. Today's talk is based upon his recent book, little promo right here, Against Humanity, Lessons from the Lord's Resistance Army, published by the University of California Press in 2018, and so sorry to take a little bit away from you. Read the book, you can get it for free if you can get into the electronic side of the University of California Press, but run out and get your own copy as well. The book is just as full of ethnographic surprises as it is of analytic insights. He brings us up close to complicated people, such as a woman kidnapped in Uganda by soldiers of the Lord's Resistance Army as a child, who, like others, became a wife of one of the soldiers and then escaped. But refusing any easy narrative of either victimization or heroism, he examines how this woman and others became deeply a part of the Army's ideological and military work. Even after leaving the bush and the Army, comfortable narratives of redemption are similarly refused through complex attachments to Army soldiers, to the children born of these unions, to political sensibilities, and to ways of constructing futures in Uganda. Rather than forming a clever bag of theoretical tricks, these refusals lead Dr. Dubal to ask a fundamental and challenging question, one that takes us beyond the critiques of humanitarian reason that have refashioned medical anthropology in recent years. Dr. Dubal asked us to join him as he presents, in his words, a collection of the lives of Lord's Resistance Army rebels, lives that are too complex to be understood through the simple moral lens of humanity, unquote. As we grapple with forms of violence that are often labeled brutal and inhumane, he asks us to open our eyes and our ears and our brains to, in his words again, a tale of new forms of ethical life that arose in the course of the rebellion, forms of life beyond humanity. Beyond the hideouts of the army, Dr. Dubal traces new and troubling sensibilities and questions that emerged as ex-rebels confronted the violence of everyday life in rural working class areas of Uganda. He thus asks us to think beyond the boundaries set by notions of humanity and thus to unthink the very category itself. The structure of the book is fascinating, a sort of kaleidoscope in which a new conflict in which humanity is constructed and pulled apart emerges and is placed dialectically with others, thereby refusing both linearity and closure. There is a chronology here in looking from wartime experiences to the aftermath of war, but the linearity in any sort of neat war versus peace binary is precluded when the imagined after conflict futures become unstable, uncertain, and perhaps we could almost say inhumane social lives, even more so in some ways than abduction, life in the bush, and exchanges of horrific violence. He is currently formulating a new ethnographic project on practices of sports betting and visions of political futures in Uganda. Frankly, it makes a lot of sense to me, having worked on really things like epidemics where everybody's dying around you. It's kind of nice to find a different kind of project, which might be a little more upbeat and not necessarily like wrenching your soul and heart out at every turn. So I think that's a great idea. I look forward to being able to hear more about it. And most importantly, I would like you to join me, and here's of course his title, to join me in welcoming one of our friends and part of the community, Dubal.
Thank you. Thank you, Charlie. It's really wonderful to be back here at Berkeley and to see so many familiar faces. I'm very grateful to Martha and Deborah and everyone from the social medicine and African studies who invited me to speak. Before I start, in case there's anyone who's a little hard of hearing, I have a couple of copies of the talk if you'd like to pass around. Feel free to take that. So it's a real delight to be able to speak in the Center for Social Medicine, as social medicine in a broad sense has and continues to be the driving tenet of both my intellectual and practical work. As Charles very eloquently put it, I'm going to be presenting some material from this book, Against Humanity, which was published last year. I should mention, for my own personal reasons, that I'm on the job market currently, and so I would be grateful for comments that were both related to that angle, the professional angle of the talk, as well as the actual content of the talk. That would be wonderful. We'll get to that in the Q&A, I'm sure. So I'll start with that brief overview of my talk today. Discussing fieldwork among former rebels in northern Uganda, I consider the richness and diversity of life that exists outside certain notions of good prescribed by the concept of humanity. I unpack the ways in which rebels were seen to be outside of or against humanity by virtue of their violent operations in the bush. Operations that they were seen to have done unwillingly, having usually been forcefully conscripted. In doing so, I want to question what is meant by the concept of humanity generally, and especially as an object for humanitarian, medical, and other forms of action supposedly aimed at the common good. I'll conclude with some reflections on the practical possibilities of an anti-humanist stance towards social change, particularly within medicine, which is a field near to me. So let's dive into the title of this talk, Against Humanity. Some of you may have a sense that there's a word missing here, crimes, that might look a little bit better now. And for those of you who have some familiarity with the Lord's Resistance Army, this title probably looks quite familiar. And so the Lord's Resistance Army, or LRA, is a group of rebels that formed in northern Uganda in the late 1980s. This slide just gives you a bit of a picture. Uganda is a landlocked country here in red in East Africa. And the rebellion began amongst the Acholi people who are in the north in this, more out here actually than down here, but the northern part of the country. They were formed in opposition to current President Yoweri Museveni, who's pictured here in the bottom left, who overthrew the existing government and took power in 1986, power he's enjoyed ever since. During the coup, Museveni's army carried out atrocities against the Acholi people, and he enjoys very little support amongst the Acholi today. The LRA's leader is Joseph Kony, who has been called, quote, Africa's most wanted war criminal. Raised a Catholic, Kony was said to have come from a family of spirit priests. At some point in the late 1980s, he became possessed by or filled with several spirits. A medium of these spirits initially focused on healing and preaching before being instructed to gradually build a rebel army. Like many spiritual rebellions before it, the LRA was guided in its tactics, actions, and beliefs by the instructions of the spirits that spoke through Kony. New fighters, who were almost always forcibly conscripted rather than being recruited or self-volunteered, were anointed and purified before going into battle. Holy precautions or rules issued by the spirits governed the behavior of the rebels. The spirits issued prophecies, directed fasts, revealed medicinal treatments, and otherwise helped and protected the rebels who risked injury or death by breaking their rules and losing the spirit's protection. Certain rebels mediated the spiritual aspects of the war, often from a sacred space known as a yard. Taking to the bush, the LRA carried on a war that has lasted over 30 years now. This is not the time really to go into a detailed history of the war and its causes, although we can talk about that in the Q&A. But I just want to point out a few important things for the purposes of the talk about the Lord's Resistance Army. So by 2001, and after the September 11th terror attacks, the LRA found itself lumped together with terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and blacklisted in the US Patriot Act. A couple of years later, in 2003, President Museveni referred the rebels to the International Criminal Court, which in 2005 issued warrants for Joseph Kony and other LRA commanders on charges of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Here's a picture of a wanted poster for Kony on the left, issued by the International Criminal Court, and then a Time magazine cover highlighting the hunt for Kony. Around 2005, the LRA began moving operations out of Uganda and into Central Africa. This is a map of the borderlands where the LRA operate today. There's probably about 200 forces left. They're not terribly organized or carrying out much activity, but they still exist. People are out there. Then again, I just want to make clear that they haven't actually been active in Uganda for about a decade, over a decade. Under then President Obama, the US sent 100 military advisors to Central Africa to organize action against the LRA, although this mission ended in April 2017, a couple of years now. Globally, within Uganda, and to a large extent within the land of Acholi, the LRA became known as an inhumane force operating against or outside the human. Upon signing into law an anti-LRA bill in 2010, Obama reproduced a widely held global humanitarian and scholarly discourse about the LRA. And I quote Obama here. The Lord's Resistance Army preys on civilians, killing, raping, and mutilating the people of Central Africa, stealing and brutalizing their children, and displacing hundreds of thousands of people. Its leadership, indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity, has no agenda and no purpose other than its own survival. It fills its ranks of fighters with the young boys and girls it abducts. By any measure, its actions are an affront to human dignity, end quote. So in this narrative, the LRA committed inhuman violence, killing and mutilating government collaborators and disobedient rebels, including with so-called primitive weapons such as logs and axes, beating and hacking them to death. They operated in the bush, a dangerous space of nearly impenetrable vegetation filled with dangerous animals and spirits. They fought, according to one scholar, I quote, without a clearly articulated political agenda, or at least a very strange one, end quote, following the seemingly whimsical commands of spirits. When rebels defected or were captured, they needed to be reintegrated into a peaceful civil society, transformed from brutal killers with quote-unquote animal minds into useful, productive, human citizens. They were seen sometimes as perpetrators deserving of scorn and punishment, sometimes as victims deserving of charity and sympathy, and sometimes as both. Many of these tropes were called upon by the American NGO Invisible Children, who launched a popular video called Gone 2012, designed to generate popular support for US military action against the LRA. On this slide are some of their campaign materials. The image on the left is a poster that juxtaposes Gone with Osama bin Laden and Hitler as the worst. The video went viral on YouTube, receiving more than 100 million views to date, and setting the record for most views of a video in a single day at that time at 30 million. So with this background in mind, let's go back to the title. Given what I've told you about the LRA so far, perhaps Crimes Against Humanity would be a better title. Indeed, these are among the charges that face one LRA commander, Dominique Onguin, who's pictured here on the slide. As we sit here today, he sits in a jail in The Hague, where he's been on trial since late 2016. He faces 3 counts of crimes against humanity: murder, enslavement, and inhumane acts of inflicting serious bodily injury and suffering. But the title is no mistake. I'm not going to talk about how inhuman and inhumane the LRA were. By contrast to most scholarly approaches, I do not ask how or why the LRA were or were not part of humanity. Rather, through a critical investigation of the defining criteria of humanity, I ask why humanity would exclude the LRA. So instead of squeezing or reforming the lives, experiences, and narratives of my LRA friends into the normative framework of the human, I treat rebel lives as the norm and ask what we can learn from them about the concept of humanity. My work suggests that we need to think twice about what humanity really is. The materials I collected, the stories I heard, and the people I talked to, all this forced me to try to come to terms with the problem of humanity. The central finding that follows from my ethnography is this: that claims to humanity are too limiting and simplistic to capture the complexity of the social lives of the LRA rebels. I do not only seek to point out that humanity is a poor concept in empirically describing the richness and diversity of life, destroying with its moral prescriptiveness the meaning and truth that certain practices and beliefs bring to rebels. But also I'm more interested in pointing to the real effects that humanity has as a discourse and practice, one that is used by and circulated among state, humanitarian, and religious actors, as well as scholars and civilians. The primary effect of this discursive regime is this: expanding a certain notion of the good through which particular versions of violence, being, materiality, politics, and so forth, become hegemonic and thereby questionable. At its heart, humanity seeks not to democratize access to the good, but rather to monopolize control over it, doing violence to the very concept by dictating the parameters of what counts as good. On this basis, I want us to consider the broader possibilities of social change rooted in anti-humanist philosophy. Okay, so I've given you a bit of the background into the LRA and introduced the conceptual framework that comes out of the ethnography. So let's get into the meat of the talk now. So the lives and experiences of the rebels dislodge major master narratives about humanity and its others. And unfortunately, I can't present all the facets of the argument today, but in the book I compile in more ethnographic detail in each chapter limits, essentially, of a particular criterion that we use to think about or define the human, be it reason or certain forms of kinship. And I'm happy to talk more about that afterwards as well. But for our time today, I'm going to pull out and unpack 3 specific threads central to how humanity is made vis-a-vis the LRA. And they are violence, the bush, and humanitarianism. This material begins to show the damage done by crude representations of the LRA through the discourse of humanity. And the ethnographic material I'm drawing upon was collected primarily during 13 months of ethnographic fieldwork from 2012 to 2013. with a network of former LRA rebels in and around the northern part of Uganda. So let's begin with the issue of violence. In particular, I want to talk about a certain type of spirit called Chen. Chen has been described by other scholars as the vengeance ghost, or the troublesome spirit of a being who has been killed. This ghost physically haunts those responsible for the killing unless or until some form of justice or reconciliation is fulfilled. It was commonly thought by non-rebels that Chen haunted LRA soldiers who had killed in battle. But rarely did people say that Chen also haunted Ugandan army soldiers, even though they too killed. Why was this? What I came to understand was that the LRA were exclusively seen to be haunted by Chen because rebel violence was seen as morally wrong in comparison to state violence. And specifically, it was considered morally wrong because of the rebels' supposedly more primitive technologies and practices of killing. Let me explain by detailing a curious feature of Chen, namely its fear of guns. People largely agreed that Chen feared guns and thus did not haunt shooters. Indeed, some suggested that pointing guns at those haunted by Chen could chase the spirit away from them, relieving them of their suffering. Others rationalized the shooting of bullets into the air, commonly done at state burials, military burials in particular, as a way of scaring away any remaining Chen from the deceased soldier so that the Chen would not be buried with him or her. While afraid of guns, Chen did not fear other technologies of killing, such as the axes and machetes that the LRA were known to have used, examples of which are pictured here. Unencumbered, Chen could thus haunt killers employing less machine-like tools of violence. In addition, so long as a soldier remained with his gun, he could continue killing without fear of being haunted by Chen. It was only when he returned to civilian life that, without his gun physically present, Chen might attack him. So, modern technologies of killing challenged the way in which Chen manifested, and in turn how or even whether the killing would be socio-morally condemned. When a killer employed modern techniques or technologies in enacting machine-like forms of physical and/or structural violence, especially from afar in both place and time from the actual killing, Chen was less likely to be able to follow the killer. On the other hand, when a killer employed non-modern techniques or technologies in enacting spectacular forms of physical violence, especially in close proximity in time and place to the killing, Chen was more likely to be able to follow the killer. According to this logic, gunmen shooting anonymously and from afar avoided Chen, but machete killers killing up close and personal did not. In the eyes of many LRA, this kind of characterization was seen as a technique by which they were marginalized and stigmatized. To them, claims that they were haunted by Chen was usually seen as an abusive epithet rather than a statement of fact. Chen, as I discussed, was less frequently used to explain the behavior of or apportion blame to state soldiers of the Ugandan People Defense Forces, some of whom are pictured here, loading up onto a gunship, which is a weapon technology that the LRA never had. In the words of one of my rebel friends, quote, "People say the UPDF don't get Chen because of the manner of killing. UPDF kill with guns and the LRA kill with sticks and the rest." Nor was Chen used as a concept to condemn structural violence, such as that of the forced displacement of civilians into internment camps, which are pictured here in this slide. By the late 1990s, as part of its counterinsurgency campaign, the Ugandan government began forcing civilians into internment or concentration camps. This was done ostensibly to provide them safety from rebel attacks, but actually to cut off rebels from resources. Such was the violence of this displacement that it was labeled by some as an attempt at genocide of the Acholi people. Mortality levels in camps reached 1,000 deaths per week, and people were largely denied access to their fields and homesteads, ruining livelihoods for years to come. In total, about 1 million people lived in the internment camps, including most of the Acholi people. In the words of the Acholi historian, or historian of Acholi rather, Ronald Atkinson, quote, "The structural violence of camp life produced a far greater number of deaths than those caused by the LRA, just more quietly and unobtrusively." Humanitarian organizations like the World Food Program and indeed the US government became complicit in this form of state structural violence. They provided, as you can see here, the food that kept people alive in camps and were largely co-constructed of the camps themselves in conjunction with the government, the Ugandan government. But even though the structural violence of the camp killed more people than did the weapons of the LRA, Chen was not set to haunt the orchestrators of the camps. Put simply, modern technologies of killing, such as through guns or internment camps, were less likely to attract Chen to those employing them. When speaking of Chen haunting former rebels then, one reconstructed LRA violence as immoral, non-modern, and illegal. Underlying the concept of Chen then was a moral framework for violence that distinguished the good from the bad on the basis of technologies of killing. Moral judgments that reflected social anxieties about delays in and impediments to development, which I'll talk a little bit more about in our next section. Amidst these anxieties, LRA violence that used primitive rather than modern technologies of killing was condemned. The visibility of LRA violence offers a partial explanation for this moral distinction. Here I join Talal Asad as he asks, quote, why is dismemberment by a machete, for example, more shocking, more barbaric, than the same result obtained by a missile? The interesting point is that being hacked to death by a machete or blown up by a suicide bomber is regarded as inhuman, a notion that presupposes there are human ways of killing and dying, as well as inhuman ones. Indeed, ways of killing and dying are part of how we define the human, end quote. So I argue that it's primarily through a modern moral framework that violence and humanity bifurcate, and that this rubric constitutes the dominant framework by which LRA violence was judged as inhuman. LRA violence transcended specifically modern moral values about the relationship between violence and technology, including both weapons and a kind of state humanitarian necropolitics. It was through the violation of these specific moral codes that inhumanity came to describe LRA violence. The LRA killed, to be sure, but so did the Ugandan army and humanitarian agencies. I'm happy to refer you to the work of a good friend and colleague, Adam Branch, who has an excellent book on the kind of humanitarian disaster, essentially, throughout the war. Only spectacular LRA violence came to be characterized as immoral and inhuman, precisely because that violence was seen as non-modern. So let's set aside this question of what makes violence inhuman here. And I'll move on to the next thread, the second thread, which is the bush. So the bush, or the loom, as it's called in Acholi, is a kind of grassy wilderness. By one Acholi civilian definition, it's a space in which humans do not live. In this way, loom is opposed to home or homestead. People may make temporary visits to the loom to hunt, gather firewood, tie goats and cattle to feed, and so forth, but they do not permanently settle there. This slide shows a picture of loom in northern Uganda. Classically, again, it's just a kind of wilderness without any footpaths, no farming, often space for hunting. In the Acholi imagination, loom is loaded with specific moral meaning and a specific relation to the human. It's a largely non-human, an animal, and more often an evil or bad space than a good or clean space. Loom, especially during the course of the war, became a dirty, feared, wild, violent, and backward space of spirits, animals, and madness. The loom is of course devoid of material or technological progress that might otherwise be seen or observed in town. Electricity, roads, and concrete buildings, to name a few. More recently, loom has expanded in everyday linguistic use to refer to not only uninhabited grass or wilderness like this, but also rural villages far from town centers. Rural areas more properly called charo, but referred to more casually as loom. In a region shaped by anxieties about and discourses on modernity, the village has, for some, been reduced to a kind of spatio-moral wilderness. In referring to the village as loom, a usage strictly incorrect and also denigrating to the village, loom is defined primarily against markers of modernity rather than the absence of human settlement. So, why am I talking so much about the loom here? The reason is that this is where the LRA fought their rebellion. For decades, the rebels have traveled, lived, and fought in this space outside the township or the home. This is a picture of some rebels walking through the loom. At the beginning of the rebellion and before visually sighting the rebels, villagers rumored that the LRA were not humans, but rather kinds of animals or beasts, perhaps shapeshifters known to exist among hostile neighboring tribes. They were seen as dirty, diseased subjects. Moreover, by virtue of staying in the loom, rebels were characterized as being backwards or left behind in terms of a developmental modernity. This slide illustrates this well, I think. This is a political cartoon that appeared in a Ugandan daily, in which imagined rebel life as being backwards technologically, materially, and mentally. You see Coin depicted here in a grass skirt, puzzled as he stares at a satellite phone that appears too sophisticated for a beast like him to use. A friend and former rebel said of Simile imaginations of the LRA, quote, "They think that people who stay in the loom don't wear clothes," end quote. By virtue of operating out of the loom, the rebels came to take on valences of the immoral and inhuman in the civilian imagination. I'm going to focus on the question of development in my discussion of the loom. And development was a subject that arose quite often on a radio show called Dwogchen Pacho. Dwogchen Pacho meaning come back home, is a weekly Acholi radio show that is aimed at LRA rebels who are in the loom, encouraging them to defect. During his shows, the host, Dubal, who's pictured here in this slide in his studio, constantly alluded to rebels being left behind, wasting their time, fighting for no reason, while people at home moved forward. This was particularly true in the material sense, whereby rebels were said to have missed out on the symbolic matter of development, including laptops and motorcycles that people in town had enjoyed. Indeed, rebels were sometimes scorned for riding bicycles in the loom, while people at home had upgraded to motorcycles. My friend Odo was a rebel for over 2 decades before he was captured and unwillingly returned home by the Ugandan army. He contested the idea that rebels would find their expectations of material modernities fulfilled if they were to leave the loom and return home. During one particular Dwogchen Pacho broadcast with Dubal, a woman formerly in the LRA came onto the airwaves to call on her husband, who was still in the loom, to defect. She said that she had heard that her husband had become injured, but told him that this should not deter him from returning. There are other injured LRA, she explained, who are back home and living well, including Odo, who she named explicitly on the air. I should mention Odo had one of his legs amputated after having stepped on a landmine in battle. Odo had not listened to the broadcast himself, but when I told him about it, he was bitter. He had not seen the woman who had used his name in over 4 years. "How does she know I'm staying well here?" he angrily asked. "I'm not staying well. Why is she talking like this?" he scoffed. If indeed the rebel defected and came to visit Odo, he might have thought otherwise. "What kind of good life was I told you were having?" Odo suggested the rebel might ask him upon seeing the simple huts in his rural Acholi homestead. Recalling the conditions of his own life and those of mutual friends of ours who had returned from the LRA, he suggested that the idea that former rebels were enjoying a, quote, good life at home was highly deceptive. Indeed, most rebels who had come back were suffering daily, digging by hand with worn hoes on their small gardens, and living in rural areas plagued by problems like heavy drinking, joblessness, and land conflicts, none of which were mentioned on the radio show. The laptops, motorcycles, and televisions that Dubal, the host, spoke of remained distant, inaccessible dreams, even once rebels had left the loom. Not only were such material modernities out of reach at home, but also they were not absent in the loom. Rebel friends spoke often of the equipment that they had in the loom. Phones, GPS, laptops, motorbikes, trucks, and so forth, many of which they did not have on their return home. This slide is a portrait of a couple of rebels in the loom. It's part of the cover of the book, but what I really want to point out here is the presence of this cellular communication device that's sitting next to the rebel. Staying in the loom for years did not mean that rebels missed out on development, but it did mean that they were seen as undeveloped and immoral in civilian eyes. By virtue of having stayed in a wild space for so long, the LRA were not seen as fully human, but rather as partly animal. As my rebel friend Musa said, quote, "People think if you stayed in the loom, you're like an animal. You have 4 legs. You changed into animals and birds, that you have fur on your body. They imagine your behavior has become like that of animals. They think you eat just anything because you're a guerrilla, end quote. Like many LRA soldiers with limited or no understanding of English, much less Spanish, Musa heard and understood guerrilla warfare as guerrilla warfare. And many rebels saw themselves as animals living in the loom, replicating the living conditions and lifestyles of guerrillas and the animals. Curious, I often ask my friends to tell me why, as they saw it, this kind of fighting was named after these animals. Some suggested it was named for the way that the animals organized and fought. Others said that they were living on their own in the loom, foraging for wild plants without relying on anyone, like gorillas. One of my friends drew from a sermon he remembered Joseph Cohen giving in the loom. Quote, Cohen said that he who believes in me shall stay like a wild animal, and the day after tomorrow, when he's reaching the end of his life, he will change back to being a human being. And the good thing for which you're fighting, you'll see it achieved when you have changed. End quote. Now, identifying as non-human animals is a highly ambivalent practice for many former rebels. On the one hand, it made them, particularly in civilian eyes, appear to be backwards, underdeveloped, dirty, and impure. In this way, being excluded from the human was both an insult and a punishment. But on the other hand, it made them both exemplary and threatening, offering them strength and purpose as rebel fighters, in ways similar to those offered by the imaginary, or the imagery rather, of lions that are often used to characterize and glorify African leaders. I use pseudonyms throughout my work, and explicitly asked many of my friends what names they would want to appear in the book in lieu of their real names. And one of them chose Lavour, which is lion. He chose this, he told me, because he wanted people to know that he was a, quote, fierce person, Danomagye. His choice of name well illustrates the fact that animality in Acholi, and as conceived of among ex-LRA in particular, is not quite the unambiguously depraved condition into which one might fear falling, having been expelled from humanity. So it wasn't just that rebels asserted themselves as part of a modern humanity that they had been cruelly left out of. They questioned and sometimes transgressed, by virtue of their spatial and social being, what had been posed by Acholi civilians as a more or less inflexible set of anthropomoral boundaries, that is, boundaries dividing what was human and good from what was non-human and evil. The LRA reminded them that such boundaries are always historically contingent, dynamic, and contextual, pointing to the shifting nature of these discourses and the moral fields that they attempt to cement. They deconstructed a cohesive Acholi civilian notion of the anthropomoral space, the good space for humans to live in, and exposed the reliance of this notion on specific notions of life as well as fantasies of development. So I'm going to finish the ethnographic section by discussing the third topic, which is humanitarianism, and specifically the question of victimhood. What I've shown so far is that rebels were often subjectified as violent, backwards animals. It should come as no surprise then that NGOs tasked with reintegrating former rebels into civilian life envision their task as a process of rehumanization. As shown in the NGO pamphlets on this slide, NGOs characterize this return as a salvatory transition, one from darkness to light, from hopelessness to hope, worthlessness to value, captivity to freedom, loom to home, trauma to health, emaciation to fullness, irrationality to reason, violence to peace, destruction to production, pollution to cleanliness, and indeed, inhumanity to humanity. Reintegration was not attempted as a process by which people were brought together in ways that carefully considered the uniqueness of their experiences and being. Rather, it was an attempted process closer to a resubjectification, a disciplinary attempt to destroy old subjects, rebels, to make new ones, humans. As with prisoners and slaves, the subjectivity of the rebel was to be exercised as a moral imperative. As part of this attempt to turn rebels into humans, a large-scale humanitarian economy was built around the concept of aiding former rebels. Within these humanitarian economies, former LRA rebels were not portrayed as politicized, willing soldiers. Rather, they were subjectified as pure victims whose childlike innocence was taken from them as they were horrifically abducted into a murderous and mad cult. Humanitarian NGOs like Invisible Children, the NGO that produced the CON 2012 video that I mentioned earlier, treated them as apolitical children, victims of abduction and violence who were robbed of their humanity and were in need of rehabilitation, love, and care. So many anthropologists, following a logic well elaborated by Didier Thassin, might respond by saying something like this. Of course, this kind of victimhood narrative reduces people to a bare life, treating them as not fully human precisely because their militant politics are ignored. And I think that this seems true from the outside, that this kind of move appears to depoliticize and pacify the subjectivities of rebels who, denied their political agency, would be stripped of humanity itself. And this, of course, is an intellectual analysis at its roots in some of the work of Carl Schmitt, and many came after him. But from within, rebels didn't see victimhood and militancy as mutually exclusive in the way that theorists often do. They were both victims and militants, both charity cases and rebels. Many rebels had spent years in the LRA and continued to hold strongly anti-government views, but had nonetheless joined on their return home various organizations or groups that explicitly positioned themselves against the LRA. My friend Odo, that we spoke of earlier, was in fact one of them. Given his identity with the rebels, it came as a great surprise for me to learn that he had worked for Invisible Children, the very organization that had organized the CON 2012 campaign I discussed earlier. At first, he had joined them seeking to continue primary school education, but he ended up making bracelets for them for a few years in Gulu town, which is the largest town settlement in the northern part of Uganda. He loved his work, which paid good wages, though he did have his disagreements with staff, sometimes upsetting them with his straight talk that corrected lies about the LRA or epithets used against the rebels. He got along well with them and held nothing against them. They helped me a lot, he gratefully explained. He spoke nostalgically of the organization. He didn't look upon them badly, and he was greatly disappointed when his contract with them ended, forcing him to return to the daily drudgery of manual farming on his rural village field, cultivating pigeon peas and sorghum. If Invisible Children were to call him up to work again, he claimed that he would immediately return to work with them. Much as accessing humanitarian aid required a performance as a suffering victim within a certain compassion economy, this did not mean that politicized rebels did not find truth in that performance. That is to say, many of them saw themselves worthy of pity, as people who had suffered for having been abducted and taken to fight. I am a person with problems, lapeko, Odo stress. These problems wouldn't have been there if I hadn't been taken away by the LRA. Another friend told me, ex-rebels should be pitied. Being a rebel isn't easy. In this way, my friends were often grateful to be pitied, especially as this was an alternative to being scorned. Indeed, some ex-rebels clung to their identities as pitiable subjects as a way of eluding stigma or hatred from neighbors and kinsmen on their return. Most rebels were simply surprised when people treated them with kindness. When my friend Benjamin returned from the LRA and visited a small trading center near his home, people came and welcomed him back. He reflected, quote, "I hadn't been pitied like that before. I didn't think they would have pity like this on someone who had returned from the loom. It was strange to see." Accepting the pity that they were shown was also sometimes a precondition for political safety, for de facto amnesty. Accepting and seeing themselves as victims allowed many ex-rebels rights to justice and other forms of legal and social protection that they needed to continue to live securely. For some, identifying as victims was merely a discourse of safety or a way to access capital. For others, it also spoke a certain truth about their lives, one that could coexist with political militancy. Being a victim did not preclude ex-LRA from being active political fighters or resistors. Indeed, it was precisely suffering and problems that led many young men to boast to me that they were ready to go to the loom to join the LRA, or another group of rebels. This same suffering led former LRA like Odo to wonder whether they would have been better off were they still fighting in the loom. So what can we learn from this unusual situation? We find fault in versions of humanity that equate victimhood with depoliticization and thus with dehumanization. These versions ignore the complex ways in which the so-called victims themselves speak and act in the trenches of such regimes and discourses. When we look carefully at things on the ground, we see that this kind of humanity overestimates the subjectifying power of humanitarian regimes and discourses, including victimhood, to strip people of their political claims and imaginaries. To clarify, I'm not arguing that rebels retain their humanity in the face of humanitarian attempts to pacify their politics through ethics, but rather I'm pointing to the way in which the concept of humanity historically constructs the ethical in opposition to the political, prematurely fixing them in a way that's inconsistent with their dynamism and multiplicity. So in the time that remains, conclude with a synthesis of my argument, together with some reflections on its implications for social change. I've tried to show how the concept of humanity prescribes certain notions of the pure and the good in ways that obfuscate the experiences, beliefs, and social lives of LRA rebels. Humanity opposes LRA violence because it does not conform to certain modern technological expectations of moral killing. Humanity divides forms of being into human and non-human forms, assigning distinct moral spaces for each kind of being. Spaces here based on a certain framework of modern materiality. Rather than embracing the continuity of animals and humans in their shared habitats, humanity proclaims one group sacred and excludes all others in both name and place. Humanity also theoretically limits the kinds of relationships that can exist between a politics and an ethics, restructuring an understanding of the ways in which rebels can exist simultaneously as both militants and victims. In importing very specific notions of the good, shaped in ideals of modern violence, technology, modernity, reason, and so forth, humanity performs violence against the common good. The common good is about justice for all, but humanity is very much about what a specific vision of the world judges as good. This vision claims to align with justice, but it often contributes to injustice by distilling complex lives into simple moral judgments in ways that often, as in the case of the LRA, reproduce racist modern visions of the Euro-American imagination. Humanity misrepresents lived realities and experiences as it attempts to assign moral value. It hegemonizes what counts as good in ways that are difficult to question or challenge. It prescribes a narrow vision of the good rather than being open to the possibilities of and meaning found in forms of life outside of it. For those who find freedom and meaning in life beyond humanity, humanity rejects their lives because of the way it reads their violence, irrationality, animality, and so forth. Humanity does not democratize access to the good and monopolize it. Rebel lives confront humanity at its frontiers, threatening its cohesive moral sanctity by exposing its instabilities. Taking rebel lives seriously helps denaturalize humanity by showing the kinds of violence that humanity does in representing or shaping the lives of people who are otherwise seen to live beyond its borders. And challenging humanity offers the chance to denaturalize and disrupt normative moral assumptions about ways of life otherwise positioned outside its borders. This challenge might open up new philosophical and practical paths to the emancipatory outcomes toward which I think humanity aspires. So clearly humanity is a problematic concept and one that I personally don't feel is worth holding on to. So I want to ask provocatively, what would it mean to be against humanity? How can a reasonable person claim to be against humanity, particularly in the aftermath of the Holocaust and the rise to Western consciousness of the category of crime against humanity as an unassailable evil? Humanity has today been elevated to the sense of the highest moral good. Our global society prosecutes people like the LRA commander, Dominic Ongwen, that it sees as committing crimes against humanity. Even in the academy, scholars often absent-mindedly use humanity to help readers understand forms of life that arise in the midst of violence and suffering. Many in my tribe of medical anthropologists, for example, speak of humanity to describe the good in generally grim tales of suffering and pain. But, I want to argue, like race or rationality or development, humanity is a social construct that must be critically interrogated rather than taken as a natural category. As an established liberal form of moral affective thinking, it is an ideological tool constructed within particular material, economic, and socio-political conditions, many of these racist and with colonial origins. So, make no mistake, to be against humanity is undoubtedly an unsettling proposition. In an attempt to deconstruct humanity, I should make very clear that being against humanity does not imply making a moral argument for genocide, ethnic cleansing, mass violence, rape, or similar so-called crimes against humanity, directly or indirectly. It does not suggest camaraderie with ethno-nationalists and xenophobes who would consider asylum seekers to be pests infesting America. I am against humanity, yet I care deeply about social inequalities that bring about pain and suffering for the poor, people of color, and other marginalized groups. There are those, I think, who may generally agree with the critique of humanity presented here, yet argue for its rehabilitation or its salvation from its Western bourgeois origins. The cultural theorist and philosopher Sylvia Wynter, for example, seeks an alternative humanity freed from what she calls a specific ethno-class genre of being human, that is, the figure of man with a capital M, in the hopes of our eventual emancipation, of our eventual full autonomy as humans. This is an admirable aim, but it seems difficult for me to envision even liberated forms of humanity freed from distinctions between good and evil. After all, in the case of the LRA, it wasn't just humanitarians that set rebels off as outside humanity, it was also rural Acholi civilians. Still others may agree with the problems posed by the concept of humanity, but find it practically useful, particularly as a response to the policies of Trump and other white supremacist leaders. Of course, humanity does have its calculated uses as a method that can help meet marginalized people's calls for recognition and belonging, particularly at a time when there are serious characterizations of the other as non-human and thus not deserving of or able to access certain rights and services. But I worry that however practical, such well-intentioned responses that grasp onto a universal abstract humanity do not allow space for real, non-liberal recognition of otherness, a space from which to truly honor difference. And so with these reservations in mind, what I want to offer is the possibility of life beyond humanity. A certain kind of post-humanity is a way of thinking and indeed recognizing the significance of forms of life that exist outside certain historically and politically constructed moral boundaries. It's a way of attending to what Alexander Wahelier refers to as, quote, the interrupted dreams of freedom found in those spaces deemed devoid of full human life, in a movement toward another kind of freedom, which can be imagined but not yet described. I'm concerned as much with the theory of humanity and anti-humanism as I am with the practices of a diverse group, including probably some of those who are here today, who might identify as healers in some fashion, many of whom have relied on humanity as a philosophical bedrock for their work. If we are against humanity, what are we for? I want us to think about new radical prescriptions for healing life beyond humanity, performed in the name of something other than humanity. For me, anti-humanism is a way of opening up the tightly controlled and regulated moral spaces constituted by humanity. And giving anti-humanism a chance is giving a chance to the kinds of experimental life that just may help us reach the common good. So I'd like to finish today by offering a preliminary translation of the social theory of anti-humanism into the clinical practice of medicine, an area sometimes considered a humanitarian practice and one with which I'm most familiar. Specifically, I want to introduce the idea of an anti-humanist medicine and detail some of its liberatory potential. Rather than focusing on diseased individuals who manifest social problems, an anti-humanist medicine focuses on social diseases that manifest in individuals. This shift, which may appear to be subtle, reorients the clinician to the problem at hand, not only a patient, but also a social structure, policy, or practice. In this form of medicine, patients would not be treated simply as individuals who manifest social problems, but rather, more radically, as social problems manifesting in individuals. Or, to revive the philosopher Louis Althusser, carriers of structures. By seeing disease as the reification of disturbed social relations, we can reinvent biomedicine as a micropolitical practice on sick societies, and thereby begin to denaturalize the historical depoliticization of clinical practice. Perhaps anti-humanism is not an obvious solution to the problems of biomedicine. After all, many think that anti-humanism is precisely what is wrong with medicine today. Many doctors look more at computer screens than at their patients. Patients are shuffled in and out of exam and operating rooms, cases of diseases like pneumonias and hernias that come and go, rather than human beings with stories, emotions, and histories. The increasingly technological character of American biomedical practice, including electronic medical records, has led to discontent among patients that their doctors treat them like robots instead of human beings. and the corporate structuring of healthcare delivery has led many practitioners to feel unable to care for patients in the way that they want. What we need, many say, is more caring attention to patients and their suffering. In other words, we need more humanism, not less. In humanism in medicine, they find a form of opposition to the kinds of approaches that treat patients as disease cases to be processed through clinical algorithms and technologies that seek to extract surplus value from the power of the disease and corporatized system. Humanism in medicine is a moral response to these problems. By contrast, what we need, I think, is an anti-humanism to provide a structural response outside the bounds of what we simply feel to be good. This anti-humanism is patently not the technological and factory-like anti-humanism present in much of American clinical biomedicine today. I'm not interested in transforming caring clinicians into bureaucratic agents, unmoved by the suffering of patients and forsaking bedside manner. But at the same time, I'm wary of the alternative that asks physicians and other medical professionals to be more humanist, to show more care for their patients and their suffering as human beings, as though this would bring justice to them. This ideology, as I show in this slide, was central to a marketing campaign at an East Coast hospital where I underwent part of my training. I stood many a times kind of gazing into this sign and wondering. Humanism is not synonymous with care, but only constitutes a specific ideological construction of it. One can try to be more kind and loving toward patients, yet still function as a reformist corporate bureaucrat, unable to see the forest for the trees, fixated on individual instead of collective good. So what would an anti-humanist medicine look like? I propose that a patient will no longer be treated merely as a case of osteoarthritis, but nor will she be seen as a pleasant manual laborer who's had a hard life, a human being with individual stories, emotions, and histories. Rather, she will also be recognized as a case of structural adjustment, racism, and surplus value extraction, among other forms of social discord and conflict manifesting in individuals. For example, a case of unemployment that might manifest as depression following job loss, a case of capitalist accumulation, for instance, a patient who has developed lung disease following years of addictive smoking, secondary to active corporate advertising to increase tobacco consumption, among other diagnoses. Thinking about the patient as a manifested structure expands the orders of recognition of violence, better attending to the multiple ontologies constituent of the complex reality of that violence. This brings me to some invaluable lessons from the Ndembu doctor made known by anthropologist Victor Turner in the late 60s. This doctor saw his task, as Turner describes it, less as curing an individual patient than as remedying the ills of a corporate group, and read the sickness of a patient as a sign that something is rotten in the corporate body. Taking its cue from this form of social healing, an anti-humanist medicine will not work only on individual human beings, but also on the collective social problems and structural conditions that manifest in them. Practicing this kind of medicine will require a new language that exceeds the existing discourse of biomedicine, a way to make visible otherwise unrecognized forms of disease, its etiologies, and its possible treatments on the body of the individual patient. It will require that clinicians and patients alike break the hegemony of individualistic or biomedical models of care and disease, and open themselves to new and more collective ways of thinking and naming disease and treatment. When today a trauma surgeon performs an exploratory laparotomy after a bullet perforates the bowel of a young black man in Oakland, her operative report may indicate a postoperative diagnosis of, quote, perforation of large bowel secondary to gunshot wound, and her operative repair may include a colectomy with a colostomy. Within an anti-humanist medicine, we might see the surgeon add an additional diagnosis, judgification and unemployment secondary to racist legacies of slavery, one that reveals why, rather than simply how, social disease manifests in an individual, and suggests an additional possible treatment, perhaps a referral to Black Lives Matter. To think beyond anatomical or physiological imaginaries is not an easy task for clinicians, nor sometimes patients, to accomplish on their own. They require help in transcending biological individuating discourse and reformulating their worlds as also social, historical, racialized, and otherwise constructed ones. Moreover, they are more often entirely focused, and justly so, on the acute biomedical emergency. lacking the necessary time and space to craft alternative imaginaries. What is needed is a form of reunification of social medicine and public health with the clinic. In other words, a reunification of collective healing with individual healing. Practically, this could take form in the integration of those other expert diagnosticians and healers of disease, especially of the body politic, social scientists, community health members, psychologists, activists, patients and their families, public health workers, progressive social workers, and so forth, into clinical teams. When the surgical team rounds in the morning on the hospitalized black man that I've described, it's the anthropologist or the historian or the Black Lives Matter activist on the team who's able to point to the legal, historical, political, and social diagnosis, if the patients and their families can't. That's incorporated into the operative report. It's these people who are able to make the referral to a radical organization for political action that aims to fix the social conflict that manifested as a perforated colon in the patient. While the physician diagnoses and heals the biological body, other healers diagnose and attend to the collective disease carried by the body. There is some movement in this direction, with ongoing attempts to articulate and practice a structural competency, one that Seth and Seth Holmes and others who are involved in the Berkeley Center for Social Medicine have been diligently working on. And as I think that they can probably verify, it's really quite a titanic task to remake biomedical ontologies and epistemologies and their resultant practices, but one that I think is well worth attempting. So I think we're at a crossroads when it comes to healing our sick societies. There's one road that most have already chosen and traveled down, which is the road of humanism and humanity, a never-ending recourse to the idealism of some future equality as though it existed today. The other, a road with a dangerous name of against or beyond humanity, takes the radical and liberating step of refusing to be duped by an ideology that offers a bandage as a treatment for a rotting abscess. One is against humanity because he or she is not inspired by the vacuous gesture that all are deserving of equal treatment. Rather, he or she is inspired to move beyond humanity with the radical notion that the oppressed deserve more than the oppressors, and thus that their lives will be preferentially valued. Thank you.